Today we're going to talk about what it looks like to lead in a growing church. And there's lots of great churches out there, and we happen to be a church that wants to continue to grow. And growing in a leading church means that things shift and shape over time, and it means that you have to clearly identify what your priority is going to be and how you kind of transmit those priorities through different stages of growth within a community. Because early on, nearly everything you do in church is really organic. Most things happen just through the context of relationship. You can notice who's new, you can notice who's been coming for a long time, you know who's doing what simply by just standing in the room. But as you grow, it's harder to identify who the different people are and what they do and how they got to do that. Even something like we're doing here with Equip, years ago, everything we would do by way of our leadership development was all done across a coffee table. It would just be me, my wife, maybe a few leaders having a relationship with someone, just talking through their life, talking through their character, talking through the dynamics of the church. As the church continues to grow, in order to keep transmitting those values, you have to create systemic things to respond to what used to be organic. Sort of like an organism, you know, an amoeba is just one little cell and it doesn't really need a lot of structure in order to survive. But if there's 3 or 4 or 5 cells, those cells have to know how to work together and what it means for them to work together to keep that whole organism alive, and on it goes. So as things continue to grow, they have to change, they have to adapt. Much like your own body does. Your body grows in different ways. I happen to grow with my feet and my hands and my head first as a kid. So there's these stages where you're kind of awkward and things don't fit together right, but you just learn how to grow and shape, and you have to build the right kind of systems and infrastructure over time. And I know throughout church life people get concerned about becoming corporate, but here's the deal for me, and when I think about our church, we will never ever have a day in the life of our church that we'll put a sign on the door that says, "We're full, closed for business, you can go to hell." And any church that doesn't think about what it is to grow is effectively saying that everyone can go to hell. That really our life with God is about us, it's about our life together. We don't really care about you if you don't know Jesus, or we don't even care about what it is for you to be a part of our community. And the truth is, every person that joins a church, it's because someone else paid the way for them. Someone else made a way for them to be a part of that community. Someone made process and emotional commitments so that that person could have room for them to be a part. And your job, my job, is to continue to make room for other people that want to experience new life with Jesus who haven't had an opportunity to do so. And that means over time, we move from organic to systemic things in order to keep the DNA and the values of who we are, and yet and continue to reach out and connect with new folks, specifically new folks coming to know Jesus. And so as a pastor, I'm committed for our church to continue to grow. Every single year I'm the pastor. Every single year I'm in leadership of our church, I want us to be engaging and connecting with new people. And there's all kinds of different ways to grow, and we can talk about that maybe some other time. We'll talk about a little bit today, but there's ways to grow by way of multiplication, by way of church planting and activity around the world, by way of serving the poor and engaging different domains of our city. There's a lot of things we could talk about there, but ultimately we have to continue to make space to grow, and that means growing things do change. But I also have a commitment, we have a commitment as a church to not just grow bigger, but to grow smaller all the time. We want to continually grow in our capacity and context to reach out to more people to be a part of our community, but we also want to create context where people grow smaller in life together. And by and large, that makes sense of our commitment to small groups and small group leadership. And in our community, we're consistently saying that real life in the kingdom is not lived in rows, but in circles. And you don't live in rows where you're all just facing one person preaching or listening to one person teach. The way that the real life of the kingdom is worked out is in circles, where people are facing one another engaging in the nitty-gritty of their lives and their relationships and their finances, etc. And you have to have small groups and circles by which you work out your life with God. So much of the New Testament can only be actually lived out in the context of small groups. And so we have a deep commitment to that as well, to have real life together, real community, real relationships, real places where we're working our life with God. So we have a simultaneous commitment to grow bigger and smaller all the time, every single year. And that might sound like it's not possible, but it is possible. It is possible to do this because the New Testament gives us a model. They were in the homes and they were also gathered together in the temple courts. Thousands of people would gather together and they would also gather in their homes. The model that we see throughout Acts is both. It's a both and, it's not an either or. And I know different people have different convictions about different things. There's the house church movement that says, you know, mega churches don't make any sense. Mega churches say the house church movement don't make any sense because they don't lead anybody to Jesus. Everybody's trying to argue as though it's an either or. I think it is a both and it's a both and all the time in the biblical model and also just in the way people work out their life with Jesus. And if you just look at the worldwide church, you know, the largest churches in America do not compare to the largest churches around the world. God is using just large churches to lead tens of thousands and millions of people into life with Jesus, and also then challenging them to live in real community with one another in the smallest ways possible. And so as a church, we want to commit to both, and the only way you can do both as you continue to grow is to think a little bit more systemically, about systems of life, much like your body is a series of systems, respiratory and circulatory and your nervous system and all of these musculoskeletal system, there's probably more, endocrine, I don't know. There's all these different systems, they work together for you to be able to do all the things that you do. That's exactly how a growing church needs to operate. And so we have a commitment to remain stable as we grow, and that really comes through small groups. And small groups enable a number of things. I listed a few there on your outline. Enable, a personal touch, allows for practical coping mechanisms for life. If you actually are living out life with other people, you're not just listening to some information about how to work your life out, you're talking to others. Allows people to use their talents and their gifts. It enables people to practice the things of the kingdom within a context. We're not going to let anybody on the stage to preach, we're not going to let anybody on the stage to do worship music, but we can involve people in smaller contexts growing into their gifts and their talents. Enable us to filter our culture through the Bible. As much as I try to as a communicator, or different communicators on our stages and stages all over the country, every week try to help people see the Bible through their worldview and see the world through the Bible, we're going to fall short of that, and it's in the context of communication and actual living out the stories of the Scriptures that we filter out what it is to really be followers of Jesus in our context and our time. Different gifts can be used as we're in different smaller contexts, and also fosters accountability and change. It's in the context of relationships you really figure out if you're growing, you're becoming more like Jesus. People actually see you, not just in a span for an hour. Hopefully you're forming relationships where you're having meals in each other's homes and your kids are around each other's kids, and you're seeing people in their marriage and their real life, and things start to connect and you can see what's really going on. So when we think about stages of growth in a church, a little chart here that's going to show you just kind of some of the dynamics of how these things shift and change over time. When you think about the stages of growth in a church, you're going to see the way we're describing this is in terms of like an animal, as I was talking about organisms, that every animal has the ability to take over the entire biosphere. They really do. Every single animal has the ability to take over the entire biosphere, meaning, like mice, when they have more mice, they have a whole bunch of them, and they have them a lot, but a lot of them die. But they have the ability to have a lot of offspring. As you get into larger animals, like on the other end of the scale we have here an elephant. An elephant has a huge long gestation period. It takes a long time to have another elephant. But when an elephant has another elephant, its mortality rate is really low and will likely grow up to be, healthy and a strong elephant. And so different animals, based on their size and their complexity, have different abilities to reproduce and or create. And so ultimately, if we're all trying to grow, every church is trying to figure out what kind of animal it is by its leadership, by its gifting, by its calling, by the city that it's a part of. And so different animals have the ability to reproduce more often and with more likelihood of success, depending on their size and their sort of organizational structure. And so really every church has a responsibility to grow up to the size that God gives them grace to grow up to, and to continue to try and develop and grow. But it'd be silly if a mouse tries to be an elephant, and it's also silly if an elephant tries to be a mouse. They both need to be wise about what it is they're trying to do and what it is for them to reproduce. And so through here we have the different stages. Stage 1 would be a house group, which we're calling a mouse, which would be a size of 3 to 35. This would be classically a house church, or it would be a church plant and stage, where you're just starting out. 3 to 35, you ultimately really only need a volunteer leader at this stage. It doesn't make sense to have a full-time paid pastor. It makes sense for a pastor to be bivocational, even if the budget's there. I'm always coaching church planners. Work some hours so that you can engage your city, be with people. And I mean, how much time do you need to pastor 30 people? And that you don't need a lot of time. So it would be wise for you to be engaging in the context of your city, and then engaging the church as a volunteer leader. Now, as that church continues to grow, it becomes a small church, which we're calling a CAT here, which would be 35 to 75 people. And there are some sociological barriers here that are fascinating. The statistics vary a lot on how the stages of these things work. There's been lots of people, from Christian Schwartz to Wagner to da-da-da-da. There's all kinds of people with them, all kinds of studies on how church growth works and how these different stages actually work. A lot of these things are socially constructed. So it's different in Africa than it is in America. It's different maybe in the UK than it would be in China. These things have different sociological dynamics, just by the way human beings see how relationships work based on their cultural background. But at this size, 35 to 75, you might start to get a generalist pastor. And a generalist pastor should be able to manage this fairly easily. Now, what's interesting about this size is where this fits within the overall measure of churches in America. So just a little quiz. How big do you think is the average size church in the United States? So just right now, just write down what you think the average size church is in the United States. Okay, and then tell your partner, tell somebody next to you, this is how big I think the average church is in the U.S. Did you come up with an answer? Average, that means a really big church is small. Okay. Well, the average church in the U.S., now the statistics vary, but are usually capped somewhere around this 75 number. Let's say 60, 70, somewhere like that. The median sized church, which is if you have them all lined up, you pick the middle, is significantly lower. It would be somewhere around 50 to 60 people. Now that's a surprising statistic to most people, but there's a sociological reason for that, and that is it's right around 75 that a social group sort of can know everyone else in an intimate way. This is, sociologists refer to this as a primary group, meaning that this group kind of latently, without realizing it, doesn't want to get any bigger because they don't want to have to feel responsible to include any more outsiders. This is the size at which they all know each other and the pastor feels adequate to pastor that many people. So this is why most churches don't break the sociological barrier, because psychologically, emotionally, relationally, this is the amount of people that I feel like I can know to some level of intimacy. And what they do subtly is they make it hard for people to come and be a part. I don't know if you've ever walked into a church where you can tell you're not really welcome. Nobody says anything, but it's the fact they don't say anything that you can tell you're not welcome. And it feels weird. It feels like they're all really deeply connected with each other, and you can't seem to kind of break in. Have you ever had that experience? That's called a primary group. And it's almost like you're walking into a room where like two people are making out. It's like, ooh, that's weird. Or, the image that I've always had, or I've heard said, is of like two golden retriever puppies, a whole box of golden retriever puppies, like licking each other, like rolling around in a box. That's how churches can feel at this stage, because people are so deeply invested and committed in one another, they don't really see or are aware of those around them. Now, if you can break through this barrier, which is usually you break through by starting to, the pastor has to be brave enough to create volunteer leadership positions that facilitate different kinds of ministry within the church. They just start releasing leadership So it's not them doing all the counseling, all the preaching, all the facilities management. They start to enable other people. You can grow to be a medium church, which we call lapdog here, which would be 75 to 200 people. 75 to 200. And this is another sociological barrier. This is the kind of a core barrier for most churches in America. So another little quiz, just statistic quiz. What percentage of churches are under 200 people in America? Now this percentage shifts here and there, but what percentage of churches do you think are under 200 people in the United States? Go ahead and write down your number. Is it 50%? Is it 80%? I already told you the average size church, but what percentage? Okay, you wrote it down. Did you share it with your partner? Did you share it with your partner? Just tell them. Okay, so here it is. Usually statistics come around 90 to 93, some have as high as 95% of churches are under 200 people. That's a lot. That's like more than just the majority. That's like, it's rare to get over 200 people as a part of your community. And there's a reason for that, and it's sociological. And these sociological barriers revolve not just around the sort of the sociological dynamic of relationship. You've already broken through some of that. So now you're used to seeing some people, other people. But it's around this stage that now, you know, the senior pastor can't be related with by the bulk of the people. Now this is really hard for people because even though the senior leader might have released leadership, people are still referring to the senior leader by way of personal leadership and or counseling. And this becomes complicated because it's at this stage that the senior leader, the pastor, needs to actually release a few specialist leaders and other pastors that actually people engage with relationally and by way of leadership in their own personal life. And the greatest hurdle at this stage doesn't have to do with the structures, it has to do with the emotional makeup of the pastor and their key leaders, to where a pastor says quite literally, I can't meet with you, I can't talk to you, I can't have phone calls. You need to talk to your small group leader, you need to talk to this ministry care leader, you need to talk to the marriage ministry pastor. I can't do that anymore. I know in the past we'd make an appointment, we talk, I'm actually not available to meet with you. And so, and it gets even weirder in that a chunk of leaders are no longer reporting to the senior leader. So you might even be leading a small group or leading a ministry and you're no longer able to speak directly with the leader, the senior leader, the pastor, about your ministry or your small group. There's now a small group pastor. And so you're building another layer of leadership. And the reason why this generally doesn't happen is because the senior pastor simply emotionally can't manage it. They have a control dynamic, they have a care dynamic. They're built to be someone that cares for people, to where they feel responsible for people. People get mad at this stage, they get hurt, they leave the church because they say, you obviously don't care anymore, becoming corporate, whatever. But what we're really doing is preparing a way of thinking about church that enables people to come and be a part that weren't a part. We're creating a systemic way because, and some pastors by their own gifting and leadership can push through this stage by, they can pastor 400 people loosely. They just have a lot of relational capacity or whatever. They can bust through this just by their own effort, but they'll start to burn out and the church starts to suffer. So, and it's at this stage that leaders have to decide that they're going to make that commitment with the senior pastor for that church to grow and to shape, and they're going to step into those roles and lead and hold a part of the church, and without maybe even reporting to the senior pastor. And this is a very painful stage to get through, just like the one before this, because people feel personally hurt, they feel personally invested, relationships change and are altered, and time is spent differently. But that's why 93% of churches just don't do it. Even if they have the gifts and the calling, the capacity, they simply won't, because it's ultimately emotional. Next stage we'll say is a large church, but this is actually somewhat, these categories are all somewhat false, but this one really does start to get weird with more research. We have it from 200 to 1,000. But really, probably the next barrier is 400. The next one would be 800. I'm not going to go into great length, but ultimately, most of these barriers continue to increase now around how systemic can you be? Can you start to create systems that work together? And then, because if you can do that from 200 to 400, systems will help you. Then from 400 to 800, you need to have all the systems you need, not just a few. And then to get over 800 and some, Tim Keller wrote a great article about how growth happens. It's in a cutting edge article, if you can find that on the internet, about how over 800, that all the systems work at a certain level of excellence, and you raise the bottom shelf on a lot of these. Christian Schwartz has written that as well. And then, 1,000 to 3,000, you're entering into a whole new category of professionalism by way of specialist pastors and programs and staff that enable the church to continue to grow. And I'm not even going to talk about the last one, 3,000 to 10,000, because I have no business talking about it. But as I look back over these stages, we've been through a lot of pain. It was painful for me to look at 75 people and feel like, man, we've done something. These people have all come to Christ. A lot of them come to know Jesus in our church. And then to build leaders out of that group and watch those leaders lead the church up to be about 200 people, and to have to say, man, you're a great leader, but I'm going to need to go invest in new leaders, and there's only a small team I can lead, and we need to release more leaders. These things are really painful for senior leaders and for teams. But if they can get through them, they get to see all the things that God wants to do by way of leading literally hundreds of people into the kingdom. People come in. But it's through all these processes that we still, at the lowest level, need to be releasing circles, small groups, to engage life with one another. So I have a little list here of advantages of small group leadership, and this talks about pastoral care. We're no longer thinking of the pastor, the senior leader, as the primary role for pastoral care. I say this in our Discovering Community class, and it's important to say it here now. I don't pastor our church. First of all, I mean that in two categories. One is what it means to be a pastoral gifting. I definitely don't have. I'm actually not good at care development, and many senior leaders in growing churches aren't. And I'm also not a pastor in that, these people I can't relate to hundreds of people. I just can't do it. I can't relate to all those people at the deepest levels of care in the way they need it. And so it doesn't serve them, it doesn't serve me, it doesn't serve the church for us to pretend like I'm pastoring people. Often in most of our church contexts, when we say pastor, what we're literally meaning is they just have authority. I don't think that's necessarily what the Bible means, but it's a way of speaking about authority. I like to try to tell people, I'm not your pastor. When you're in a small group, that's our primary place for receiving pastoral care. It's small groups is where you're going to get people who have leadership and have the time and the space and the gifting to engage. I love the pastoral care leaders we have and the pastoral care systems we have to manage crisis and marriage and addictions and benevolence needs. These are people that are gifted and called and equipped to do this. And so even as just a senior leader, somebody will try and grab me off the stage, talk about their marriage, talk about this. I might give them like a word or two of counsel. Here's something the Bible might say, but listen, we really need to get you into a process where you're going to get all the help you need. I can't provide that. And, could I get coffee to you and talk about, my uncle is going through this addictive thing? I'm not going to be able to provide that for you. First of all, I'm not good at it. I'm really not. But second, we have ways at this stage that you're going to need to do that better. When we were a smaller church, I had to try really hard to be pastoral. I wasn't very good at it. I had to have that role, but my role has shifted over time, and senior leaders have to be able to do that. Next thing would be with small group leadership is you encourage leaders to develop. You can have a space where you can build new believers into future leaders that will lead the church. The church is built from the inside out. It's built with infrastructure. You have bones and tendons and muscles that strengthen and enable your body to grow. And so we're building from the inside out when we build small groups and circles. Relationships provide the groundwork for stability in the church. At the end of the day, church isn't just going to be systems without lots of relationship, without life-on-life contact, where people love each other, they pray for each other, they care about each other's kids and their families and their marriages and who they're becoming as men and women in Christ. And that happens at the most basic levels of relationship, and that's why we need circles and small groups. People who start following Jesus are made into disciples. We don't want just people to make decisions, we want people that are shaped to be more like Jesus. That happens in the context of small groups. You can create risk-taking and security within small groups. Leaders are homegrown, they're tested, they're known, they're accountable, they're in unity. Guests and people that are starting to find Jesus are absorbed in the life of the church, and fruit ultimately remains when you have circles and small groups. So we're always trying to watch what our percentage of Sunday attendance to small groups are. And over time, we've had to build process that helps people do that. At the beginning, when you're 75 people, it's easy to get people to go from a Sunday experience to a small group because you know who they are, you invite them to your house, you connect with them. But over time, the jump from number of 100 people, 400 or 500 people in a service into a small group is huge. To drive to someone's house, even if you have a nice board, even if you have them all lined up, you usually need another step. And so that's where we've built different vehicles along the way, things like Discovering Community and welcome dinners and welcome lunches and events that help people process from men's and women's events and different things. And we've tried to build a simple church process that enables people to move from relationship and space to space to space. And we track those things. We track Sunday attendance, how many are visitors, how many have we followed up with, how many have gone to a welcome dinner and welcome lunch, how many have gone to Discovering Community, how many in Discovering Community end up in small groups and serving. And along the way, as the church continues to grow, we keep building other little engines that fill in those gaps. You think of it almost like pipes. We're not going to have complete transmission from a guest all the way to someone who's committed and belonging in our church, but we do want those things to have some percentages on them that enable us to see, is that process actually working? And that we're not just playing imaginary basketball. John Wimber had this great analogy of how guys like to play imaginary basketball. 3, 2, 1, it goes in. Most people, you've ever done that, you've ever seen a kid do that? 3, 2, 1, yeah, he makes it again. You always make it. So that's because there's no ball, there's no hoop, there's no team, there's no score, there's no refs, there's no nothing. It's totally made up, but you feel good about it. And that's the way a lot of ministry works. People are doing ministry, they're not measuring anything. There's no ball, there's no hoop. There's no sense of is anybody meeting Jesus in our community? Is anybody, growing into community life with one another? Is anyone developing into leadership? There's no measurements for anything, and therefore we never really know if we're winning or we're losing or how we're doing. So we want to try to build process systemically that enables us to see, are we producing the kinds of disciples that we're hoping to through the different things we're doing? And over weeks and months and years, those things change. We realize some things maybe work for a season and not another one. So we always reserve the right to change those because our ultimate goal is to build relationships with one another. And I love our Sunday experiences. I love the Rose environments. I love where we have the best worship, the best teaching we can find as a community. But we know that that's ultimately not going to produce the disciples that we want to be in our city, to shape our cities and to shape the world around us. That discipleship happens in the context of relationship. So we try to build process that gets to that. And if you have questions about how we've done that, I'm sure even from the time that I'm recording this to the time that you're listening to it, it's probably changed. So I don't want to go through and tell you all those steps, and maybe we could do that in the context of conversation within leadership and any environments you're in with a staff pastor or a leader. I'm sure they could help you think through that. One last thing I just want to cover really quick is how ministries emerge within our church. What does it mean to have a ministry? What's it mean to want to lead a men's or a women's ministry or whatever? And because here's what I want to tell you just up front very clearly. You're released to do any ministry you think God has called you to do. If you think God's called you to do ministry by the power of the Holy Spirit, you should do it. You don't need me, you don't need the church, you don't need a budget, you don't need anything. You do what you think God has called you to do. Do it. Every single person is released to do any ministry they believe that they're called to do. Period. Now, every time I do this, there's usually a few staff pastors and leaders go, oh my gosh, I can't believe Jay's doing this. But you are. Now, here's where it's different. If you want to do ministry within any of our environments, i.e. a Sunday, a small group, whatever, with our people that God has called us to pastor and lead, or with anything that has to do with budgets. So any environment, any place, any people, or any amount of money. If you want that from our church, well, then that means that you have to go through a process. Because we're accountable for the environments that God has given us authority in, for the people that God has given us to shepherd and care for, to build and develop into disciples, and we're accountable for the provision, the money that God has entrusted to us. And we have to stand before God. I have to stand before God one day and give an account for how I manage those things, where those things were apportioned to. So if that's what you want to use, if you want an announcement time, then we're going to have to go through a process because we're accountable for that. Other than that, if you just want to go out and start ministries, you're allowed to do that. That might not be wise because usually ministries should be built within the context of a community. But we have a process, and there's a number of different ways. One of the things is what you're doing now, developing into leadership, thinking about character and those kinds of things. We want people to lead out of who they are, not just what they do. But out of that, beyond that, we also have a process, a way that we can do this. Anytime somebody comes to me and says, I want to build a ministry, I always say, tell me about the small group you're in. Tell me about the circle of people that you're living life with and how you're doing that ministry now. People tell me they want to build a men's group. I say, tell me about the men you're building into now. See, because you should at the most organic levels be able to engage men in, if that's what you want to do as men's ministry. If you want to do women's ministry, you should be, if you want to do outreach, tell me about the people who are coming to know Jesus now. See, because ministry should flow out of your life, and it should be evidenced by the things that are actually happening around you, the fruit that's being born. If that is happening, say, yeah, actually I've been meeting with the 4 guys in our men's group, we've been talking through life, great. So now let's talk about what it would look like to maybe do an event on behalf of our community. So we're not going to go right from a small group to now you're the leader and we give you a business card and you build a leadership team or whatever. Let's actually see one event. Let's see if we can run an event where we can gather and engage people within the life of our church. Let's see if that actually builds into something. So you've been building into men. Why don't you get these men to try and bring their men, all the men they know, and we're going to build a men's breakfast, a men's night. We're going to do whatever it is that you'd want to do that would be the substance of the ministry. Maybe you share a vision of what you're hoping for or dreaming of. And let's see if A, anybody comes, and B, if anybody wants to come back. So let's try and do 2 or 3 events. And if we start to build momentum with events, well then it sounds like we might have a ministry. So now we're going to build leadership teams and processes and rhythms and goals and plans. And we're going to build teams to kind of execute those things. That's when we form a ministry. But it goes in that order. People often come and just say, hey, we should have a small, we should have a single mom's fair. That's a great idea. That's a great idea. But all they want is for me to give them 5 announcements and give them this amount of budget, this and that. Listen, I invest in people that lead things, not just ideas. And so if you want to be the kind of person we're going to invest in for that, I'd love to see you do something for a few single moms now. Are there any single moms you're building in their life now? Have you identified them? Have you built relationships? And then let's try and do one event before we're going to build a whole ministry of care around this. Let's try and do an event, maybe a fair, before we build then a whole mentoring program or whatever. But often people jump to the end without being willing to do the small steps. And ultimately, if you don't do the small steps, you're not the kind of person that God is going to use to lead a ministry. And ultimately, what I'm looking for, what I think every pastor should be looking for, is leaders to build ministry. I can look in the church and see gaps. I can see, man, we need something more with youth. We need something more with men's. We need something more with addictions. But ultimately, I know if I just build programs without leadership, they don't work. You can't just adopt programs. You need to build people and see that God calls people into certain types of things. And I love it when I see the Holy Spirit starting to stir a group of people who are ministering in a different environment to different kinds of people, maybe than we haven't before, to the poor or to refugees. We've seen refugee ministries built in our church just through a few people. They get stirred, engage refugees, get their small groups too, do a few events, and the next thing you know, we have a whole ministry where many of our small groups are engaging refugees, and we help plant churches. We do all kinds of stuff, but it starts at those most basic levels. So if it's in your heart to lead ministries in our church, maybe that don't exist or in a greater degree, start engaging in a process where you're doing it at the smallest levels, and we'd love to see the fruit born from that, because we pour water, meaning money, time, energy, attention. We pour water, that would be the water, on things that produce fruit, not just seeds. We don't just look at people's ideas, we look at what they're actually producing. We know if you have a plant that can produce this much fruit with this little resource, we're going to pour some water on that and watch a harvest. But we're not going to pour water on seeds, an idea. We want to see actual fruit where people's lives are actually changing based on the leadership of people's lives. And so these are some of the things we see that enable us to maintain stability and be healthy as the church continues to grow. And it'd just be good as you have questions, want to make some space here for you to ask questions about how churches grow, how our leadership adapts and responds to new needs and new problems. Because one of the great things about being a larger church is growing is we have the capability to do incredible things because we have bigger budgets, we have more people, we have more specialty. That's what's really exciting about being a part of a growing church. So every stage we continue to grow, new people pop up and say, man, we should have this kind of ministry, that kind of ministry. And that's super exciting because it means we can be great at what we do, but it means we still have to focus and push everything back to those most organic levels of leadership development and life together if we want it to be healthy over the long haul. So if you have questions, things throughout the times that we've been talking here about different dynamics of leadership, if we've been discovering leadership together, character, leans, the kingdom of God, growing, being part of a growing church, fruit to root, growing in our own intimacy with God and dealing with some of the pain that's within, that we can comfort others out of the comfort we've received. This is a great time. We're going to make a little space here for you to ask some questions to process some of these things moving forward so you can lead well in our church. Thanks for being a part of this whole process.